That evening, having fortified himself with a modest dinner of cold beef and potato salad, the George's cook, he surmised, had learned her culinary arts during some particularly austere period of English history. Wimsey made his way to Carstairs Manor to examine the scene of Mrs. Carstairs' unfortunate demise. The drawing-room, where he was received by the victim's son, Mr. Gerald Carstairs, a gentleman of 40-odd years with the peculiar appearance of a man who had grown accustomed to deference and found it rather agreeable, proved to be precisely as one might imagine. Furniture of the solid Victorian persuasion, curtains of heavy velvet in a shade of burgundy that had absorbed decades of cigar smoke and sorrow, and that particular odor which old houses accumulate when they have successfully resisted modernization. Mr. Gerald Carstairs was, by all accounts, the model of a dutiful son. He had remained at his mother's house, maintained her accounts with meticulous attention, and had shown no inclination to marry, which had pleased his mother considerably and prompted village speculation of the most predictable sort. He was, however, also demonstrably pale beneath his fashionable veneer, and his fingers, as he offered Wimsey a cigarette, trembled with what appeared to be genuine distress rather than performative sorrow. Wimsey accepted the cigarette with thanks and observed, with that particular casualness that masked his most acute attention, that Mr. Carstairs seemed to have acquired a fresh bruise along his left temple, a contusion still quite purple and tender to the eye, the sort of injury one might sustain from a collision with a door-frame or, conceivably, from a rather more deliberate encounter. The study lay on the ground floor, a room of considerable utility but limited charm, lined with ledgers and agricultural journals and those volumes that country gentlemen acquire when they wish to maintain the appearance of erudition without subjecting themselves to actual thought. The desk occupied a position before the windows, which overlooked the garden in that melancholic manner of windows that face northward. The leather chair behind the desk still bore a slight impression, as if Mrs. Carstairs had only recently risen from it, or, Wimsey reflected with his characteristic detachment, as if the police had chosen not to disturb it, having perhaps learned from some dim recollection of police procedure that one ought not to overturn crime scenes with excessive enthusiasm. The door, which remained locked, the constabulary had taken possession of the key, which hung from a brass peg beside the mantelpiece, was of solid oak construction, and possessed a lock of the sensible, efficient type that one finds in country houses built by gentlemen who trusted neither their servants nor their neighbors. The window catches, when Wimsey examined them with Bunter's aid, for Bunter, summoned from the hotel, had proven himself invaluable as an assistant to investigation, were indeed fastened from the interior, showing no signs of tampering or recent disturbance. Mrs. Carstairs, or rather the arrangement of her person, had been removed to the village undertaker's establishment, but her position had been documented with admirable precision by the constabulary photographer, whose work, though technically unremarkable, conveyed the essential tableau with sufficient clarity. The Brussels lace mantle, now in the custody of Inspector Farthingdale as evidence, had been, according to the photographs, draped about the deceased's shoulders in a manner that suggested deliberation rather than accident. The folds fell with theatrical elegance. The lace caught the afternoon light in a manner almost reminiscent of portraiture. The face, unfortunately bleached in the photographer's flash and rendered somewhat ghoulish by the angle of the camera, nonetheless conveyed a certain peaceful expression, as though Mrs. Carstairs had simply fallen asleep during an afternoon's quiet study. It was this peaceful expression, Wimsey suspected, that had troubled Inspector Farthingdale most acutely. Murderers, in the constabulary's experience, left behind expressions of either violence or fear, not the serene countenance of a woman who had drifted toward oblivion without struggle or complaint. The adjoining room, to which the maid, one Miss Eleanor Prescott, a woman of 30 years with the bearing of a person who had long since reconciled herself to obscurity, had been confined throughout the afternoon, presented itself as the secondary mystery. It was a small parlor, comfortably appointed with feminine furniture, where Mrs. Carstairs apparently spent her leisure hours attending to correspondence and needlework. The wall between the study and this room was solid brick, and whimsy, tapping upon it with methodical care whilst Bunter observed from the doorway with that expression of patient approval he reserved for his employer's more eccentric investigations. Detected no hollow spaces, no hidden cavities, no architectural peculiarities whatsoever. Miss Prescott, when summoned to relate the events of Monday afternoon, proved to be a woman of limited imagination, but admirable precision in her recollections. She had been, she stated, engaged in the mending of bed linen. Mrs. Carstairs had entered the study at approximately 2:00, requesting that she not be disturbed, as she intended to attend to matters of household accounts. At 4:00, Miss Prescott had brought tea, finding the study door still locked, and had been informed, through the solid oak, to leave the tray upon the hall table. At 4:30, the maid had heard nothing. No cry, no sound of distress, no indication whatsoever that Mrs. Carstairs' heart had ceased its rhythmic function, and her lungs had surrendered their vital purpose. It was only when Mrs. Carstairs failed to appear at dinner that alarm had been raised, the door forced, and the body discovered in that peculiar arrangement of lace and mortality that had prompted Inspector Farthingdale's telegram. Whimsy listened to Miss Prescott's testimony with an expression of polite interest, though his attention seemed primarily occupied with the study window, which he examined with surprising intensity. The glass was old, he observed to Bunter, sufficiently old to have acquired those subtle undulations that only decades of settlement and temperature variation could produce. One pane, in particular, exhibited a rather interesting pattern of weathering along its lower edge, the sort of detail that would escape the notice of a man whose observational faculties had been dulled by routine and assumption. That night, whilst Bunter occupied himself with the practical task of acquiring the household staff's statements and assembling what particulars he could regarding the contents of Mrs. Carstairs' wardrobe, Whimsy repaired to the George's modest library, a room distinguished chiefly by its collection of county histories and agricultural almanacs, and applied himself to the study of poison with the devoted attention he might have lavished upon a particularly engaging work of classical literature. The village doctor's conviction that arsenic had been administered seemed, upon examination, rather more supposititious than forensic in nature. The laboratory analysis, conducted by a chemist in Winchester of indifferent reputation, had confirmed the presence of arsenic compounds in the stomach and oral tissues, but had offered no enlightenment as to the precise method of administration or the quantity involved. A poisoned cup of tea seemed the obvious hypothesis, yet no cup had been discovered, no residue of poison found upon the study's furnishings, and most damnably no obvious source from which the arsenic might have been obtained. Mrs. Carstairs kept no poisons within the house. The garden superintendent maintained his own locked cabinet for the pesticides necessary to combat the various infestations that plague country gardens, and that cabinet, upon inspection by the constabulary, remained undisturbed and fully accounted for. It was the absence of the cup that occupied Whimsy's attention most particularly. Poison, by and large, required a vessel. One could not conveniently consume arsenic by absorbing it through one's fingertips or by inhaling it as a vapor, at least not without considerable discomfort and delay. Yet the study contained no cup, no glass, no instrument from which a fatal dose might have been imbibed. Inspector Farthingdale, in his report, had noted this absence with the confident assertion that the murderer had simply removed the cup before departing. An explanation so transparently logical that it seemed to Whimsy precisely the sort of thing that a guilty conscience might eagerly embrace. The door had been locked from the interior. The constable who forced it had been the first to enter the room since Miss Prescott discovered the body. If the cup had been removed, it must have been removed by someone within the locked study, which led one to the inescapable conclusion that either Mrs. Carstairs had somehow managed to murder herself and remove the evidence before expiring, a feat of considerable improbability, or the cup had never existed within the study at all. The latter possibility suggested, to Whimsy's admittedly unorthodox mind, that poison had been administered by some method other than the traditional poisoned drink. A consideration that opened avenues of investigation that seemed to have escaped the constabulary's notice entirely. The following morning, having consumed a breakfast of eggs and toast that Bunter had somehow managed to render palatable through sheer force of will, Whimsy presented himself at the manor with the announced intention of conducting interviews with the household staff. Inspector Farthingdale, who had been expecting Whimsy to dismiss the case as incomprehensibly provincial and depart in search of more elegant murders in London's fashionable neighborhoods, seemed somewhat taken aback by this evidence of dedication. The butler, a man named Graves of indeterminate age and expression, proved to be a well-trained servant of the old school, the sort who could discuss the peculiarities of the household's routine with the precision of a military quartermaster. He confirmed that Mrs. Carstairs had maintained strict habits. She took tea at 4 o'clock precisely, always prepared by Miss Prescott in the small kitchen adjacent to the study. The cup itself was one of a matched set of Minton china, pale green with gold banding, a set that Mrs. Carstairs had inherited from her mother and regarded with considerable affection. The tray, when Miss Prescott brought it on the afternoon in question, had contained the usual accompaniments: tea, milk, sugar, and a small plate of digestive biscuits. All perfectly ordinary, all perfectly innocent, all perfectly devoid of arsenic until the moment it touched Mrs. Carstairs' lips. When Whimsy inquired whether the cup had been found upon the tray upon which Miss Prescott had placed it, Graves's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a tightening of the jaw, a momentary absence of that practiced civility that characterized his usual demeanor. Yes, the constable had found the cup, still sitting upon the hall table precisely where Miss Prescott had placed it, empty save for a faint residue of tea leaves. An empty cup, Whimsy reflected, which suggested that Mrs. Carstairs had consumed whatever had been within it. Yet the poison, if administered through the tea, should have manifested symptoms within minutes: burning of the mouth and throat, abdominal distress, the physiological signals that arsenic poisoning invariably produced. Miss Prescott, had she administered poison, would have expected to hear some sound of distress from the study. The absence of such sounds seemed to indicate either a remarkably phlegmatic victim or a poison administered in such minute quantity as to produce delayed effects. Yet the post-mortem examination had revealed substantial quantities of arsenic in the stomach contents, far more than a delayed action would suggest. It was at this point that Whimsy requested to see the Minton cup, which Inspector Farthingdale, with evident reluctance, produced from a locked cabinet in the study. The cup itself appeared entirely ordinary to casual examination, pale green, delicate, with the gold banding intact and unmarred. Yet when Whimsy held it to the afternoon light streaming through the north-facing window, he observed something that seemed to have escaped previous notice: a faint discoloration along the interior base, a subtle staining that suggested either a permanent deposit or a substance that had been deliberately applied to the ceramic surface. He set the cup down with careful deliberation and turned to address Inspector Farthingdale with an expression of polite regret. "I fear," he remarked conversationally, "that we have been proceeding upon an assumption of considerable error. Mrs. Carstairs was not poisoned through the medium of her tea, Inspector. She was poisoned, if my observations do not deceive me, through the very implement from which she drank it." Inspector Farthingdale's expression underwent a transformation not unlike that which one might observe in a man who had just been informed that the fundamental principles upon which he had constructed his understanding of reality were entirely incorrect. He stared at the cup with the intensity of an archaeologist confronting an artifact of unexpected significance, though his comprehension of its implications seemed to lag considerably behind his visual perception. It was Whimsy who, recognizing the necessity of elaboration, proceeded to explain the mechanism with the patient clarity one might employ when instructing a particularly dense but well-meaning schoolboy in the elements of natural philosophy. The arsenic, he suggested, had been applied to the interior surface of the cup itself, not as a liquid residue but as a fine powder, perhaps mixed with a binding agent such as gum or shellac, which would adhere to the ceramic and remain stable until the warmth of the tea itself activated its dissolution. The heat of the liquid, circulating within the cup, would gradually leach the poison from the ceramic surface, allowing it to dissolve uniformly throughout the tea, ensuring that each sip would carry an incrementally increasing dose of arsenic. By the time Mrs. Carstairs had consumed half the cup, the poison would have achieved sufficient concentration to produce the observable symptoms. The complete consumption of the tea would have introduced quantities sufficient to cause death within the hour, precisely the timeline supported by Miss Prescott's testimony and the post-mortem findings. The beauty of such a method, Whimsy observed with a tone suggesting admiration for its technical ingenuity rather than moral condemnation, lay in its apparent innocence. The cup itself bore no obvious marks of tampering. No liquid poison need be introduced into the study. No accomplice required access to the locked room. The poisoner need only prepare the cup in advance, place it upon the tray with the other accoutrements, and allow the victim's own actions, her reasonable assumption that tea prepared by her trusted maid was safe to consume, to accomplish the murder. It was, he suggested, the work of a mind of considerable sophistication, one that understood both chemistry and psychology in equal measure. Inspector Farthingdale, recovering somewhat from his initial shock, seized upon the revelation with the enthusiasm of a man who perceived it to offer exoneration for his previous failures of observation. He immediately proposed that Miss Prescott must have applied the poison to the cup before placing it upon the tray, a conclusion that seemed to him to restore order to his investigation and permit him to proceed toward conviction with renewed confidence. Whimsy, however, raised a cautionary hand and suggested that such haste, whilst emotionally satisfying, might prove premature. The question that demanded answering, he observed, was not merely how the poison had been administered, but who possessed the knowledge, the motivation, and the opportunity to accomplish so intricate a scheme. Miss Prescott, certainly, had been present in the house and possessed access to the cup. Yet her position seemed to Whimsy rather too obvious, rather too convenient. Moreover, the maid's demeanor, when questioned the previous day, had conveyed a genuine shock at her mistress's death, the sort of authentic distress that dissembled grief rarely achieved. Someone had indeed prepared that cup with poisonous intent, but that someone possessed intimate knowledge of Mrs. Carstairs' habits, access to arsenic, and the technical understanding to apply it in so subtle a manner. It was not, Whimsy suggested, the work of a casual malefactor or a sudden impulse murder. It was deliberate, calculated, and deeply personal in nature. To identify the culprit, one must first understand the motive that had driven someone to such elaborate preparation. That afternoon, Whimsy requested an audience with Mr. Gerald Carstairs under the pretext of discussing certain matters pertaining to the household inventory and insurance valuations. The young man received him in the drawing-room with evident unease, his fingers once more betraying that nervous trembling that had characterized their previous encounter. Whimsy, settling himself into a chair with the casual grace of a man entirely at ease, began his interrogation with what appeared to be irrelevant observations about the weather, the quality of Hampshire's agricultural output, and the curious fact that certain families seemed to produce sons of such singular devotion to parental authority. It was only when he had established, through seemingly innocent conversation, that Mr. Gerald Carstairs had indeed been in residence at the manor throughout Monday afternoon that Whimsy allowed the questions to acquire a more pointed character. Had Mr. Carstairs noticed anything unusual about his mother's demeanor in recent weeks? Had she mentioned any concerns regarding her health, her finances, or her relationships with members of the household? Had there been any particular tensions or disagreements between his mother and the servants, or indeed between his mother and himself? Mr. Carstairs' responses were measured but evasive, suggesting a man choosing his words with considerable care. His mother, he insisted, had been in excellent spirits. her health robust, her disposition serene. There had been no conflicts, no tensions, no indication whatsoever of impending tragedy. Yet his left eye, Whimsy noted with the precision that made him so formidable an investigator, exhibited a slight involuntary twitch. The sort of nervous response that betrayed internal conflict even when the mouth maintained its careful composure. Moreover, his repetition of the word serene seemed to Whimsy oddly precise, as though he were consulting some memorized script rather than drawing upon authentic recollection. When Whimsy inquired, almost as an afterthought, whether his mother had been in the habit of corresponding with anyone outside the immediate circle of family and village acquaintances, Mr. Carstairs' face underwent a subtle but unmistakable alteration. There was a moment, brief, perhaps only a second in duration, during which genuine alarm flickered across his features before he could restore his expression to one of careful neutrality. "I cannot imagine," he replied, his voice perhaps a degree too firm, "why my mother's correspondence should be relevant to her death, Lord Whimsy. She was, as I have stated, a woman of perfectly regular habits and entirely conventional attachments." It was precisely this protestation of conventional attachments that prompted Whimsy to request access to Mrs. Carstairs' personal correspondence, a request that Mr. Carstairs received with visible discomfort. The letters, he suggested with rather transparent reluctance, were private matters of no conceivable relevance to a murder investigation. They pertained to charitable organizations, village social committees, and the routine business of managing a country estate. Precisely the sort of mundane documentation that one would expect from a woman of Mrs. Carstairs' social standing and age. Yet when Whimsy pressed the matter with that particular combination of courtesy and immovable determination that characterized his most effective interrogations, Mr. Carstairs ultimately capitulated, leading him to a writing desk in the morning room, where a substantial collection of correspondence had been preserved in orderly fashion. It was Bunter, whilst Whimsy occupied himself with the examination of household accounts and estate ledgers, who discovered the letter that seemed to explain the curious tension that had permeated the Carstairs household like an unacknowledged illness. The letter was dated some 6 months prior and bore the postmark of Dover. It was addressed to my dearest Helena in a masculine hand of considerable elegance, and its contents, though couched in language sufficiently circumspect to maintain plausible deniability, conveyed unmistakably the existence of a relationship of considerable intimacy and long-standing duration. The writer, who signed himself only as E., expressed his joy at their continued correspondence, his gratitude for the financial assistance she had provided, and his hope that circumstances might eventually permit them to acknowledge openly what had so long been concealed. He alluded to difficulties and obstacles, to the unfortunate realities of their respective situations, and to his conviction that her death, for such seemed the inevitable resolution of their predicament, would ultimately free him from certain entanglements of a legal and matrimonial nature. The letter concluded with expressions of affection so tender as to suggest not the correspondence of mere acquaintances, but the genuine attachment of individuals bound by years of accumulated intimacy and shared experience. When Whimsy presented this document to Mr. Carstairs with the observation that it seemed to suggest Mrs. Carstairs had maintained a romantic attachment of some considerable duration, the young man's carefully constructed composure underwent a complete dissolution. He collapsed into a chair with the sudden loss of tension that followed the abandonment of pretense, and when he spoke, his voice carried the cracked quality of genuine anguish rather than performative distress. His mother, he admitted, had been conducting a secret correspondence with a gentleman named Edmund Fairfax, a man of respectable family but insufficient fortune, whom she had apparently known since her youth and with whom she had maintained an emotional attachment spanning decades. The relationship had remained platonic in nature, or so Mr. Carstairs had believed, until approximately 2 years prior, when his mother had begun providing Fairfax with substantial financial support. The sums involved were not inconsiderable, They represented a gradual diminishment of the estate's resources and, more troublingly to Mr. Carstairs' mind, a diversion of funds that would otherwise have constituted his eventual inheritance. The existence of this relationship, Mr. Carstairs explained with evident reluctance, had prompted within him a species of resentment that he had struggled to articulate or justify. His mother, whom he had believed devoted entirely to his interests and to the maintenance of the family's standing, had instead been engaged in a secret emotional life that prioritized the well-being of an external party over the security of her own son. The discovery had been, he suggested, profoundly destabilizing, the revelation that the person one had believed one understood entirely was in fact fundamentally unknown, possessed of hidden depths and motivations that rendered all previous assumptions suspect. Yet he steadfastly maintained that this resentment, however genuine, had never manifested in any action or intention directed toward harm. His mother had been his sole remaining parent, whatever emotional difficulties their relationship had encountered. He had neither the inclination nor the motivation to murder her. The bruise upon his temple, he admitted when pressed, had been acquired in a moment of frustrated rage when he had confronted his mother regarding her correspondence with Fairfax. She had, in her characteristic fashion, dismissed his concerns as the product of selfish jealousy, and had declined to discontinue her association with the gentleman. In his anger, he had struck his fist against the study doorframe with sufficient force to catch his head upon its edge. A childish gesture that he had come to regret immediately upon witnessing his mother's disapproving expression. Whimsy accepted this explanation with an expression of polite interest, whilst his mind operated simultaneously upon multiple levels of analysis. The existence of Edmund Fairfax introduced a new dimension to the investigation entirely, one that suggested motives and opportunities extending far beyond the domestic circle in which the constabulary had thus far confined their attention. If Fairfax had been the recipient of substantial financial support from Mrs. Carstairs, and if that support had been conditional upon her continued life and capacity to provide it, then her death would represent not liberation, but financial catastrophe. Yet the letter suggested something rather different, a hint that Fairfax might have anticipated her death with something approaching satisfaction, as though it represented an escape from some constraint or obligation. The implication was disturbing in its psychological complexity, that someone had killed Mrs. Carstairs not for what she possessed, but for what her death might accomplish in the broader architecture of another's existence. It was a murder born of something far more subtle than mere greed or anger. It was a murder of calculation, of manipulation, of an emotional entanglement so intricate that it had ultimately demanded a permanent resolution. By late afternoon, Whimsy had established that Edmund Fairfax maintained a residence in Dover, a port town situated at a convenient distance from Hampshire for purposes of clandestine correspondence, but sufficiently remote to permit the maintenance of discretion. The constabulary, upon Whimsy's suggestion, had undertaken the not inconsiderable task of verifying Fairfax's whereabouts on the afternoon of Mrs. Carstairs' death, a verification that had been accomplished with gratifying efficiency. Fairfax had been observed at his club in Dover by multiple reliable witnesses throughout the hours in question, making his personal participation in the poisoning entirely impossible. Yet his physical distance from the crime seemed to Whimsy rather less significant than his potential influence over someone in closer proximity to the victim. The question that now demanded investigation was whether Fairfax had possessed either the knowledge or the inclination to arrange Mrs. Carstairs' death through the agency of another, and if so, who that other might be. The letter's cryptic allusions to entanglements of a legal and matrimonial nature suggested complications extending beyond his emotional attachment to Mrs. Carstairs, complications that might illuminate his motivation with depressing clarity. A telegram dispatched to Dover's police authority requesting discretionary inquiries into Mr. Fairfax's domestic and financial circumstances produced, within the space of several hours, information of considerable interest. Edmund Fairfax was indeed a gentleman of respectable family, but limited resources. A widower of some 15 years, whose late wife had been, unfortunately, a woman of substantial fortune which had passed upon her death to their daughter. A young lady now of age and possessed of independent means. The daughter, one Miss Catherine Fairfax, had for some months been engaged in a romantic attachment to a gentleman of questionable financial probity named Mr. Richard Ashton, a connection that had occasioned significant paternal displeasure and had prompted Mr. Fairfax to attempt, with considerable urgency, to prevent the union through the application of financial pressure. His resources for such pressure, however, were limited, constrained as they were by the necessity of maintaining his own modest establishment and by the financial assistance he had been receiving from Mrs. Carstairs. The irony was manifest. Mrs. Carstairs' generosity, intended to support a man with whom she had formed an emotional attachment, had been diverted almost entirely toward preventing his daughter's marriage to a man he regarded as unsuitable. The financial entanglement had become, in effect, a mechanism of parental control exercised through the medium of another woman's purse. It was this information that prompted Wimsey to request a more detailed examination of the household accounts maintained by Mr. Gerald Carstairs. Documents which revealed that Mrs. Carstairs had, in the weeks immediately preceding her death, begun to express concern regarding the increasingly substantial sums she had committed to Fairfax's support. The letters in her own hand, which Bunter discovered in a locked drawer of her writing desk, indicated that she had begun to suspect the true destination of her charitable donations, and had informed Fairfax that she could no longer continue such assistance. Furthermore, she had expressed her intention to alter her will, redirecting the funds she had previously intended for Fairfax toward various charitable institutions and to her son. The financial arrangement that had permitted Fairfax to maintain his facade of respectability while simultaneously controlling his daughter's marital choices would, upon Mrs. Carstairs' death and the execution of her revised testament, come to an abrupt and final conclusion. His daughter would be free to marry her unsuitable Mr. Ashton, his own financial position would deteriorate substantially, and his carefully constructed system of control would collapse entirely into disorder and impotence. Yet the mechanism by which this catastrophe might have been accomplished remained obscure, for Fairfax's alibi was entirely unassailable, and his physical distance from Ashford-in-the-Weald made his direct participation in the preparation of the poisoned cup impossible. It was at this juncture that Wimsey requested to examine the postings of correspondence between Mrs. Carstairs and her correspondent, a request that produced a curious discovery. The letters from Fairfax bore the postal marks of Dover, as expected, but they had been delivered to Ashford-in-the-Weald at irregular intervals, sometimes arriving via the village post office, sometimes appearing upon the study desk with no clear indication of how they had entered the house. The irregularity suggested the possibility of personal delivery by someone familiar to the household, someone whose comings and goings would occasion no particular remark. Wimsey's enquiries revealed that Edmund Fairfax had made 3 visits to the village within the preceding 6 months, ostensibly to visit his uncle, a gentleman residing in a cottage some 2 miles distant, but actually, as the uncle himself reluctantly admitted when questioned, to maintain contact with Mrs. Carstairs in a manner sufficiently discreet to avoid exciting the suspicion of her son. It was during one such visit, approximately 3 weeks prior to Mrs. Carstairs' death, that Wimsey's investigation encountered its crucial turning point. The uncle, a retired solicitor named Mr. Thomas Fairfax, had offhandedly mentioned to the constable questioning him that his nephew had expressed considerable interest in the composition of certain cleaning preparations used within the Carstairs household. The nephew had, with apparent casualness, inquired whether Mrs. Carstairs employed arsenic-based compounds for the treatment of her garden or the maintenance of her furnishings, a question that had seemed innocent at the time, but which now acquired sinister implications. Mr. Thomas Fairfax possessed, it transpired, a small apothecary's interest inherited from a distant relative, and maintained within his cottage a collection of chemical compounds and medicinal preparations of considerable variety. An examination of his premises, conducted with appropriate warrants, revealed that his arsenic supplies had been recently diminished, a discrepancy for which he could offer no satisfactory explanation. It seemed increasingly probable that Edmund Fairfax had obtained from his uncle the chemical means by which his benefactor might be eliminated. But the question of implementation remained: who had applied the poison to Mrs. Carstairs' cup, and how had they accomplished this act whilst evading observation and suspicion? It was Miss Eleanor Prescott, the faithful maid, who possessed the answer to this question, though she was herself unaware of the significance of her own actions. When Wimsey summoned her once more to the study and posed his enquiries with his characteristic combination of detached courtesy and penetrating observation, her responses revealed a pattern of behavior that seemed innocuous upon its surface, but which acquired profound significance when examined in the light of Edmund Fairfax's recent visits to the village. Miss Prescott, he ascertained through careful questioning, had on 2 occasions during Mr. Fairfax's visits been charged with the responsibility of washing and polishing the household's more delicate porcelain, a task that had required her to handle individually each piece of the Minton dinner service, including the pale green cup from which Mrs. Carstairs habitually consumed her afternoon tea. On the second of these occasions, approximately 10 days prior to Mrs. Carstairs' death, a gentleman whom she had understood to be a distant relation of the family had appeared at the servants' entrance with a package ostensibly containing replacement curtain rings ordered by Mr. Carstairs from a supplier in London. The package, she stated with the innocent precision of a woman recounting a perfectly ordinary occurrence, had been left upon the kitchen table, and she had subsequently discovered within it, along with the promised curtain rings, a small jar of what appeared to be a cleaning compound, a substance of pale greenish hue accompanied by a printed label recommending its use for the restoration of lustre to fine china and porcelain. The implications of this revelation were immediately apparent to Wimsey, though he maintained his expression of polite interest whilst his mind raced through the architectural details of the crime. Edmund Fairfax had engineered the delivery of a prepared substance to the Carstairs household through the agency of a hired courier, a stranger whose identity need never be revealed or traced. The substance itself, arsenic oxide mixed with a binding agent and tinted to resemble a legitimate cleaning preparation, would have aroused no suspicion in the mind of a servant girl accustomed to the receipt of domestic supplies. Miss Prescott, innocent and diligent, had herself applied the poison to the very cup from which her mistress would eventually drink, unaware that she was administering a fatal dose through the innocent performance of her household duties. The genius of the scheme lay in its exploitation of trust and routine. No one had poisoned Mrs. Carstairs through any dramatic confrontation or obvious malice. Instead, she had been killed by her own maid, acting in complete ignorance, using implements and substances that bore all the appearance of innocent domesticity. When Wimsey revealed this reconstruction to Miss Prescott, the woman's face underwent a transformation of such profound horror that he found himself momentarily moved by something approaching sympathy for her plight. She had, quite unknowingly, become the instrument of murder, had participated in the killing of a woman she had served faithfully for more than a decade, all whilst believing herself to be engaged in the routine maintenance of household furnishings. The realization seemed to devastate her with a force that physical violence could scarcely have achieved. She collapsed into a chair with the appearance of a woman upon whom some fundamental truth regarding the nature of her own agency had been violently impressed. Wimsey, observing her distress with the detached compassion of a man long accustomed to the consequences of criminal deception, offered her what comfort he could, whilst simultaneously explaining to Inspector Farthingdale the necessity of now directing the investigation's focus toward Edmund Fairfax as the architect of the crime, if not its direct perpetrator. Yet even as the constabulary prepared to apprehend Fairfax on charges of murder, a new complication presented itself, one that suggested the architecture of the crime possessed yet another layer of sophistication than even Wimsey's acute analysis had initially perceived. A telegraph arrived from Dover bearing news that Edmund Fairfax had, upon learning of the constabulary's interest in his affairs, taken his own life in a manner suggesting premeditation rather than panic. He had consumed a dose of arsenic, the very substance he had employed against Mrs. Carstairs, and had left behind a letter of confession detailing his role in his benefactor's death. The letter, however, contained certain anomalies that troubled Whimsy considerably. Fairfax's confession was too complete, too articulate, too precisely detailed in its account of his motivations and methods. It read, in effect, like a narrative constructed for posthumous consumption, a final statement designed to close the investigation and prevent further inquiry into circumstances that extended beyond the simple proposition of a desperate man resorting to murder to escape his financial entanglements. The handwriting, upon examination by a specialist in such matters, bore sufficient similarity to Fairfax's authenticated exemplars to pass cursory inspection. Yet it exhibited certain irregularities suggestive of either extreme emotional disturbance or deliberate forgery by someone possessed of considerable skill in such undertakings. The question that now occupied Whimsy's attention was whether Edmund Fairfax had indeed taken his own life, or whether someone possessed of an interest in his silence had arranged his death to appear suicidal, thereby closing an investigation that might otherwise have expanded into areas of considerable discomfort. The Brussels lace mantle, that apparently decorative element of the crime scene, had been arranged about Mrs. Carstairs' shoulders with theatrical precision, a detail that suggested not the impersonal mechanics of poisoning, but a personal statement, a final comment upon the victim's romantic pretensions and emotional vulnerability. It was a gesture that implied intimacy, knowledge, and a species of contempt that seemed incongruous with Edmund Fairfax's professed emotional attachment to the deceased woman. Whimsy found himself entertaining the uncomfortable suspicion that the crime possessed yet another dimension, one that neither the constabulary nor the deceased Fairfax's confession had adequately illuminated. It was Bunter who, in the course of his methodical examination of the Carstairs household accounts, discovered the discrepancy that illuminated the true nature of Mrs. Carstairs' financial arrangements with Edmund Fairfax. The sums she had transferred to Dover were considerably larger than the modest allowance that Fairfax himself had claimed to receive, a differential that suggested the existence of a secondary recipient, some other party benefiting from Mrs. Carstairs' generosity through the medium of her correspondence with the gentleman. Upon investigation, it transpired that a portion of the funds had been diverted toward the maintenance of a small property in a village outside Dover, a cottage ostensibly occupied by Fairfax's elderly mother, but which, upon discreet enquiry, appeared to be inhabited instead by a woman of considerably younger years, who bore a striking resemblance to the portrait of Edmund Fairfax's late wife that hung in his Dover residence. The woman in question was one Miss Rachel Fairfax, Edmund's daughter by an earlier attachment previous to his marriage, a relationship that had been concealed from respectable society and from his legitimate daughter Catherine, maintained only through the financial assistance that Mrs. Carstairs had, with touching Navet, believed she was extending to support her beloved Edmund's charitable concerns. The existence of this hidden daughter introduced a dimension to the crime that transformed Whimsy's understanding of its psychological foundations entirely. Miss Rachel Fairfax was a woman of 27 years, educated and accomplished but barred by the circumstances of her birth from the social position her father's wealth might otherwise have permitted. She had been, it seemed, the true object of her father's devotion and the genuine recipient of Mrs. Carstairs' financial largesse, though Fairfax himself had maintained the fiction of personal need to preserve his dignity and to obscure the true nature of his maternal concern. Mrs. Carstairs, in her romantic attachment to Fairfax, had been unknowingly supporting the maintenance of his illegitimate daughter, a circumstance that raised uncomfortable questions regarding the nature of the relationship between benefactor and beneficiary. The discovery of this arrangement, had Mrs. Carstairs made it, would have been deeply wounding, not merely because of the financial deception involved, but because it would have revealed the extent to which her emotional investment had been exploited by a man whose primary loyalty remained directed toward a woman who was not herself. It was this revelation that prompted Whimsy to request a personal interview with Miss Rachel Fairfax, a request that necessitated travel to Dover and the delicate negotiation of circumstances that had, until now, remained hidden from the gaze of polite society. The young woman received him in the cottage's modest parlor with a composure that suggested either considerable courage or a species of resignation born from long familiarity with secrecy and shame. She was, Whimsy observed, a woman of considerable intelligence and perceptiveness, and when he presented to her the details of his investigation, her responses indicated that she possessed knowledge of her father's criminal undertaking, knowledge that seemed to have been imparted to her with the intention of ensuring her silence through the complicity of shared transgression. Her father, she explained with evident reluctance, had confided in her regarding his financial difficulties and his desperation to prevent her sister Catherine's marriage to a man whom he regarded as fundamentally unworthy. He had expressed to her, with what she described as considerable emotional intensity, his conviction that Mrs. Carstairs had become an obstacle to his objectives, that her intention to alter her will and terminate her financial support would render impossible the exercise of paternal control over Catherine's marital choices. The scheme, Miss Rachel Fairfax revealed, had been devised in conjunction with her father's solicitor brother, who had provided both the arsenic and the technical knowledge regarding its application to porcelain. Edmund Fairfax had arranged for the delivery of the poisoned cleaning compound, anticipating that the unsuspecting servants would apply it to Mrs. Carstairs' cup, thereby accomplishing the murder without requiring his personal involvement. The plan had succeeded precisely as intended, but its success had produced consequences that Edmund Fairfax had apparently failed to anticipate or adequately prepare himself to endure. The knowledge of his own culpability, combined with the awareness that his crime had been committed not through some moment of passionate impulse, but through calculated premeditation extending across weeks of careful planning, had proven psychologically insupportable. The confession he had left upon his death, whether genuine suicide or something more ambiguous, had represented not merely an acknowledgment of guilt, but a final assertion of control over a narrative that circumstances had otherwise rendered beyond his mastery. Yet Whimsy perceived in Miss Rachel Fairfax's account certain elements that failed to align with the apparent facts, certain omissions and emphases that suggested she was herself concealing some aspect of the truth. When he pressed her regarding the precise nature of her father's emotional state in the days immediately preceding Mrs. Carstairs' death, her composure underwent a subtle but unmistakable deterioration. She finally admitted, attempted to dissuade her father from his criminal intention. She had argued that the death of Mrs. Carstairs would accomplish nothing beyond adding murder to his catalogue of deceptions, and that the discovery of such a crime would inevitably result in consequences more severe than any financial embarrassment. Edmund Fairfax, however, had proved immovable, convinced that no other solution to his predicament existed. The letter of confession, Miss Rachel Fairfax revealed with obvious reluctance, had been written at her insistence, not as a final statement preceding suicide, but as a mechanism of ensuring that should he survive the arsenic he had intended to consume, the full weight of responsibility would rest upon his own shoulders rather than devolving upon innocent parties such as Miss Prescott or the innocent Mr. Carstairs. The revelation that Edmund Fairfax's confession might be something other than a genuine suicide note precipitated in Whimsy's mind a recalibration of the entire investigative structure. He returned to Ashford in the Weald with his perception of the crime fundamentally altered, and with a conviction that the truth extended into territories that neither the constabulary nor the deceased man's supposed confession had adequately illuminated. The Brussels lace mantle, that persistent detail which had troubled him from the investigation's inception, acquired new significance when considered in the context of this expanded understanding. It was not merely a decorative element or a symbolic gesture, it was a specific statement made by someone possessing intimate knowledge of Mrs. Carstairs' personality and preoccupations, someone whose perspective on the victim extended beyond the financial or legal dimensions that Edmund Fairfax's motivations encompassed. Upon his return to the manor, Wimsey requested permission to examine once more the study in which Mrs. Carstairs had expired. And this time his attention focused not upon the locus of the poisoning, but upon the secondary details that had hitherto escaped adequate investigation. The writing desk, where Mrs. Carstairs had customarily attended to her correspondence, contained within its locked drawers not merely the letters from Edmund Fairfax, but also drafts of her revised testament. Documents in her own hand that articulated with painful clarity her intentions regarding the disposition of her estate. She had intended, the drafts indicated, to leave the bulk of her fortune to her son Gerald, with only modest bequests to charitable institutions and nothing whatsoever to Edmund Fairfax. The documents were dated progressively through the preceding months, reflecting a gradual hardening of her resolve. A movement from affection toward betrayal, from romantic idealism toward a cold acknowledgement of reality. The final draft, dated merely 1 week prior to her death, was accompanied by a letter addressed to her solicitor, a document in which Mrs. Carstairs articulated her suspicions regarding the true destination of her financial support, and her determination to terminate entirely her association with Edmund Fairfax. It was this letter, Wimsey perceived with sudden and terrible clarity, that constituted the true motive for murder. Not Edmund Fairfax's financial desperation, though that was genuine enough, but rather his anticipation that the letter would reach her solicitor, and that the consequences of Mrs. Carstairs' revised testament would render impossible the continued support of his illegitimate daughter. Yet the mechanism of the murder and the manner in which the poisoned cup had been prepared suggested the involvement of someone with intimate domestic knowledge of the household's routines and rhythms. Wimsey turned his attention toward the study's secondary entrance, a door that connected to a narrow passage leading toward the kitchen and servants' quarters, a door that he had previously noted but whose significance he had not adequately appreciated. The lock upon this door, he observed, was of considerably older manufacture than the primary study entrance, and examination of its mechanism revealed evidence of recent manipulation. Bunter, summoned to conduct a more thorough examination, confirmed that the lock bore marks consistent with having been opened through the application of a key that was not its original, marks that suggested forceful insertion and withdrawal repeated on multiple occasions. The question became immediately apparent. Who possessed motivation, knowledge, and access sufficient to have prepared the poisoned cup in Mrs. Carstairs' study at some point prior to the fatal afternoon? The answer, when Wimsey articulated it to himself with the grim precision of a man confronting an uncomfortable truth, pointed inexorably toward a party whose presence within the study would occasion no remark, and whose actions would be beyond suspicion precisely because her role within the household seemed so thoroughly subordinate and devoted. It was Miss Eleanor Prescott herself who, under the pressure of Wimsey's increasingly specific questioning, finally abandoned her pretense of ignorance regarding the poisoned cup's preparation. She had not, she explained with the weary resignation of a woman whose careful construction of innocence had finally collapsed beneath the weight of accumulated detail, prepared the cup herself. Rather, she had been instructed to do so by someone whom she had trusted entirely, someone whose authority within the household extended beyond mere employment into realms of intimate emotional connection. The instructions had been couched in language sufficiently oblique to permit Miss Prescott to maintain a fiction of innocence. She had been asked to clean and restore the pale green cup with a mysterious preparation, a task so thoroughly routine in her domestic experience that she had questioned neither the composition of the substance nor its origins. She had applied it conscientiously, buffing the ceramic surface until it gleamed, unaware that she was coating her mistress's habitual teacup with a lethal poison. The person who had issued these instructions, Miss Prescott finally revealed through tears that seemed genuine in their expression of betrayal and despair, was none other than Mrs. Carstairs' housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Violet Graves, wife to the butler Thomas Graves and keeper of the household's domestic secrets. Mrs. Graves, it transpired, had been engaged in a long-standing affair with Edmund Fairfax, an attachment that had begun some 7 years prior when Fairfax had visited the manor ostensibly to visit his uncle, but actually to conduct clandestine meetings with the housekeeper. The affair had been conducted with considerable discretion, but it had deepened into something approaching genuine attachment, a bond of emotional complicity that had evolved from initial passion into a partnership of shared deception and mutual understanding. Edmund Fairfax had confided in Mrs. Graves regarding his financial difficulties, his desperation, and ultimately his intention to arrange Mrs. Carstairs' death. Mrs. Graves, bound to him through years of secret intimacy, had become his accomplice not through coercion, but through the terrible logic of a woman who had convinced herself that the destruction of her employer represented a necessary sacrifice for the preservation of her own emotional attachments and future security. The apprehension of Mrs. Violet Graves presented itself as a delicate matter requiring considerable finesse, for the housekeeper remained ensconced within the Carstairs household, with access to the family's intimate routines and with nothing whatsoever to lose through the creation of additional mayhem. Wimsey therefore arranged with Inspector Farthingdale a circumstance of apparent casualness by which Mrs. Graves might be summoned to the study ostensibly to discuss household matters of routine importance, a pretext that would permit her apprehension without occasioning alarm or precipitating some final act of desperation. The housekeeper, when she arrived in response to the summons, presented herself with the composed demeanor of a woman whose professional training had equipped her to maintain impeccable composure under circumstances of considerable stress. She was a woman of perhaps 55 years, possessed of that particular quality of neat efficiency that characterizes those individuals who have spent their lives in service to others' domestic arrangements, her gray-streaked hair pinned precisely in place, her black dress immaculate despite the evening hour. Wimsey, observing her entrance with the acute perceptiveness that had served him so well throughout the investigation, noted the subtle alteration in her bearing when her gaze encountered not merely Inspector Farthingdale, but also constables positioned discreetly near the study's exits. Her composure did not shatter entirely, but it underwent a perceptible modification, a recognition that the pretext of routine household matters had been abandoned in favor of more sinister purpose. When Wimsey presented to her the accumulated evidence regarding her complicity in Mrs. Carstairs' murder, the poison cleaning compound, the instructions to Miss Prescott, the long-standing attachment to Edmund Fairfax, and the recent visits during which the substance had been delivered, she did not attempt denial or evasion. Instead, she sank into a chair with the appearance of a woman upon whom some final reservoir of emotional resistance had been exhausted, and she began to speak with a toneless precision that suggested she had long prepared herself for precisely this interrogation. Her relationship with Edmund Fairfax, she explained, had originated 7 years prior in circumstances of mutual emotional vulnerability. She had been at that time a woman of middle years trapped in a marriage of convenience to a man she respected but could not love, whilst Edmund Fairfax had been a widower struggling with the emotional consequences of his wife's death and the financial burden of supporting an illegitimate daughter he could not acknowledge. The affair had begun innocuously enough. Conversations conducted during his visits to the manor, stolen moments of intimacy achieved through the exploitation of household routines that permitted temporary privacy. Over the years, the attachment had deepened into something approaching genuine affection, a relationship in which two individuals possessed of limited romantic prospects had discovered consolation and understanding. Yet the affair had remained fundamentally constrained by circumstance. Edmund Fairfax could not marry her without simultaneously revealing the existence of his illegitimate daughter and destroying the respectable facade he maintained for his legitimate child's benefit. Similarly, Mrs. Graves could not abandon her position without forfeiting her livelihood and her standing within the household that had constituted her entire adult existence. The knowledge that Edmund Fairfax had been receiving substantial financial support from Mrs. Carstairs had initially occasioned in Mrs. Graves a species of relief. She had believed that the money was enabling him to establish a more independent existence, to create circumstances in which their relationship might eventually acquire a more permanent and acknowledged form. Yet, as months had accumulated into years, she had gradually perceived the true nature of the financial arrangement. Mrs. Carstairs was not merely providing support, she was exercising control, maintaining Edmund Fairfax in a state of emotional and economic dependence that rendered impossible any action inconsistent with her wishes and desires. The discovery that Mrs. Carstairs intended to terminate this support, that she had penetrated the fiction regarding its ultimate recipient, and that she had resolved to revise her testament in a manner that would deprive Edmund Fairfax of financial resources, this knowledge had occasioned in Mrs. Graves a species of psychological desperation that had overcome her moral scruples. Edmund Fairfax had approached her not with an explicit request for participation in murder, but with a presentation of circumstances so dire that their resolution seemed to demand extraordinary measures. He had articulated to her the impossibility of his situation, the necessity of supporting his illegitimate daughter, the inability to acknowledge her existence, the certainty that Mrs. Carstairs' revised testament would render him incapable of fulfilling his paternal obligations. He had described to her, with considerable emotional force, the vision of a future in which Rachel would be abandoned to penury, whilst Catherine married a man he regarded as fundamentally unsuitable. A future in which his life's efforts toward maintaining his family would result in their destruction. When he had suggested that the elimination of Mrs. Carstairs might constitute the only viable solution, Mrs. Graves had perceived in his proposal not criminality but necessity, the sacrifice of an elderly woman of limited genuine value to the preservation of family bonds that seemed to her infinitely more significant and worthy of protection. She had therefore accepted his implicit commission, had facilitated the delivery of the poisoned compound, and had instructed Miss Prescott in its application with a series of directives sufficiently opaque to permit the younger woman to maintain sincere ignorance of her complicity. She had anticipated that the death would be attributed to natural causes, that no investigation would penetrate beyond the convenient fiction of heart seizure, and that the revised testament would be discovered to have been incomplete, thereby permitting Gerald Carstairs to inherit the estate and ensuring that Edmund Fairfax retained access to financial resources through his son's eventual gratitude. The plan had possessed a certain austere logic from the perspective of one who had surrendered her moral agency in service to emotional attachment, and who had convinced herself that the murder represented not criminality but love expressed through the only mechanism her circumstances permitted. When Wimsey concluded his presentation of the evidence by observing that she had, in effect, murdered Mrs. Carstairs not for Edmund Fairfax's sake but for her own, that she had destroyed a woman in order to preserve a romantic fantasy that circumstance had long since rendered impossible, Mrs. Graves's face underwent a transformation, suggesting that this truth, articulated with such clinical precision, cut deeper than any accusation of mere criminality could have penetrated. The confession of Mrs. Violet Graves concluded with a detail of such psychological precision that it seemed to illuminate not merely the mechanics of the crime, but the essential tragedy that had motivated it. She had, she explained, arranged the Brussels lace mantle about Mrs. Carstairs' shoulders after the woman had expired, a gesture that she had believed would constitute a final statement, a last communication directed toward a victim who could no longer receive it. The mantle represented, in her distorted reasoning, a species of apology combined with an assertion of Mrs. Carstairs' essential frivolity, her preoccupation with material ornament and social standing at the expense of genuine human connection. By draping the garment about the corpse, Mrs. Graves had sought simultaneously to honor and to condemn, to acknowledge Mrs. Carstairs' devotion to the aesthetic, whilst making a final judgment upon the emotional vacuity that such preoccupation concealed. It was a gesture at once tender and contemptuous, the expression of a woman whose mind had fractured beneath the weight of conflicting loyalties and competing moral frameworks. The constabulary, once in possession of Mrs. Graves's full confession and the corroborating evidence that Bunter had methodically accumulated throughout the investigation, proceeded with admirable dispatch toward the formality of formal charges and incarceration. Edmund Fairfax's supposed suicide acquired retroactive significance as an act of genuine self-destruction, motivated not merely by anticipated legal consequences, but by the revelation that his accomplice, the woman with whom he had maintained his long emotional attachment, had been apprehended and would face trial for murder committed ostensibly in his behalf. The knowledge that Mrs. Graves had sacrificed her own freedom and future to protect what she had believed to be his interests, and that this sacrifice had been motivated by an emotional attachment he had never fully reciprocated with equivalent intensity, seemed to have precipitated in him a species of moral collapse that rendered continued existence psychologically insupportable. His death, therefore, represented not the cowardly flight of a guilty conscience, but a final assertion of control, a decision to escape the consequences of his actions before those consequences could fully manifest themselves in the lives of those dependent upon him. Miss Rachel Fairfax, confronted with evidence that her father's confession had been a deliberate construction designed to shield her and her circumstances from public scrutiny, underwent an emotional transformation that suggested genuine horror at the revelation of the extent to which her father had been capable of deception in service to his conception of paternal duty. The knowledge that Edmund Fairfax had arranged the death of a woman primarily to preserve his capacity to support her, combined with the understanding that this murder had been accomplished through the agency of a woman whose emotional attachment to him had exceeded his reciprocal affection, seemed to have precipitated in her a species of existential crisis regarding the nature of familial obligation and the moral consequences of benefiting from criminality. She had, upon the conclusion of the investigation, expressed her intention to establish herself independently of her father's legacy, to refuse the inheritance that would have constituted the fruit of his murderous machinations, and to undertake a species of voluntary exile that might constitute some symbolic reparation for the harm occasioned by his actions. Mr. Gerald Carstairs, confronted with evidence that his mother had been murdered not through the agency of his own resentment, but through the criminal conspiracy of household servants acting in service to an external emotional attachment, underwent a curious transformation in his emotional bearing. The knowledge that his mother's death had not been occasioned by his own deficiency of filial devotion seemed to have liberated him from certain psychological burdens that had hitherto constrained his demeanor. He had, in the weeks following the investigation's conclusion, undertaken the management of his inherited estate with considerably greater confidence and facility than his previous conduct had suggested he possessed, and had begun to exhibit signs of a personality considerably more resilient and capable than his former anxious dependence upon his mother's approval had previously permitted. It was upon the evening following Mrs. Graves's formal commitment to trial that Wimsey found himself returning to the George, where he prepared to undertake the final stage of his departure from Ashford in the Weald. Inspector Farthingdale had insisted upon extending a formal expression of gratitude, a gesture that Wimsey had accepted with his characteristic combination of gracious acknowledgement and gentle deprecation. The constabulary, he had suggested to the inspector, deserved considerable credit for the ultimately successful resolution of the investigation, though he refrained from articulating the more pointed observation that the constabulary's initial conviction regarding the guilt of Frederick Ashworth had been almost entirely baseless and had served primarily to retard genuine progress toward the identification of the actual culprit. As Wimsey settled into his motor car for the journey back to London, Bunter at the controls with his usual meticulous attention to mechanical precision, he found himself reflecting upon the curious architecture of the crime that had occupied his attention for the preceding weeks. The murder itself was, in its essential mechanics, a rather ordinary affair. the poisoning of a woman through the exploitation of her household's routines and her servants' obedience. Yet the psychological dimensions of the crime extended into territories of considerable complexity. The intersection of romantic attachment and economic desperation. The collision between emotional need and moral restraint. The terrible logic by which individuals convinced themselves that the destruction of another human being might constitute an acceptable price for the preservation of their own emotional satisfactions. Edmund Fairfax had murdered Mrs. Carstairs not from hatred but from fear. Mrs. Graves had facilitated that murder not from animosity but from love, or rather from what she had believed to be love. Though it seemed to Whimsy that what she had actually experienced was more accurately characterized as a form of profound emotional dependency masquerading as affection. The Brussels lace mantle, that persistent symbol throughout the investigation, had ultimately served as the final revelation of Mrs. Graves's essential nature. That beneath her efficient and devoted exterior existed a woman capable of considerable symbolic thinking, of expressing through gesture meanings that her conscious mind could not articulate through language. It was this capacity for symbolic expression, combined with her emotional intensity and her psychological complexity, that had rendered her simultaneously sympathetic and dangerous. A woman whose crime had been motivated by comprehensible human needs, even as it had resulted in the unnecessary destruction of another individual's life. As the motorcar departed the village, Whimsy permitted himself a final observation to Bunter regarding the curious manner in which the most terrible crimes often emerged not from deliberate evil, but from the collision of ordinary human weakness with circumstances that permitted its expression. The perpetrators of such crimes were rarely monsters. They were simply individuals who had surrendered their moral agency to emotional necessity, and who had convinced themselves, through the terrible logic of self-deception, that their actions constituted not criminality, but love.